be the start of a four-part session with just a quick overview of CMMC. In the first session here, we're just going to be talking about some of the major things in the CMMC that might be causing confusion across the defense contractor community. And that's going to be the risk behind self-assessment. A lot of organizations saw the shift to CMMC 2.0 and assumed that if self-assessment was allowed, the burden's been reduced. The immediacy, the necessity of it's been reduced. The risk has been reduced. But the reality is that not only did it not reduce, it increased. It didn't even stay the same. So with CMMC 2.0, it introduced a self-assessment pathway for self-defense contractors. It was intended to simplify it for level 1 contractors, which is predominantly federal contract holders, people that aren't directly involved in the mainstream aspect of the defense contracting industry. But what it actually did was move all of the responsibility directly onto the contractor themselves. It doesn't eliminate risk whatsoever. It does create accountability for verifying your own cybersecurity posture. Today, we'll dive into a little bit about what self-assessment actually requires, where organizations misunderstand their own exposure, and how leadership teams can reduce the risk before it becomes a contractual or legal liability. It's all about reducing that risk exposure, reducing that exposure footprint. So by the end of the session, if I can get it to advance here, by the end of the session, you should have a clear understanding of what CMMC self-assessment requires, insight into some of the legal and contractual exposure tied to inaccurate attestation, an awareness of common compliance blind spots, a better understanding of executive accountability for cybersecurity governance, and some practical steps organizations can take to reduce their overall risk. Why does CMMC exist? So over the past decade, almost two, cyber intrusions targeting the defense industrial base have increased dramatically. They've increased across all industry segments, from state actors to organized groups overseas and sometimes internally. And many of these incidents involve contractors with access to sensitive information, but a complete lack of consistency of cybersecurity practices. So CMMC was introduced to establish consistent expectations across the entirety of the supply chain. The framework focuses on protecting two types of information: federal contract information and controlled unclassified information, CUI. And there we go again. So CMMC 2.0 simplified the original 5-level model into 3 distinct levels. Level 1 protects federal contract information. You work with the federal government in any capacity, you have a contract. They now want to have explicit, defined protections around not only that contract itself, but anyone who touches, handles, or holds the contract. Level 2 aligns with NIST 800-171, which protects controlled unclassified information. Level 3 goes into the 171R2 realm, and that applies to organizations working on highly sensitive national security programs. Lockheed Martin, your Wet Works, all of those types of contractors. Most contractors, I would say probably about 85% of the supply chain operates in that level 1 and level 2 area. Now, the self-assessment pathway applies to primarily level 1 and level 2, but it doesn't mean just checking a box. Historically, much of even NIST's 800-171 was a matter of going through, checking a box, making sure that you met these requirements, and that was it. But now organizations have to evaluate implementation of controls, document those controls, submit the results to SPRS or SPURS, and have a senior official affirm the accuracy of the assessment. That affirmation ties cybersecurity posture directly to contract eligibility. And that is through some of the things that have been added to CMMC in terms of FCA, which is False Claims Act. The entire point of CMMC was to make all of the components of cybersecurity not only unified and simplified across the entire industry, but fully enforceable. It's not a slap on the wrist. It's not a addressable concern. No, these are demonstrable, defined, cataloged, and logged stances of your security posture and your process control. It's no longer, we didn't know. That is not a valid protection anymore, and it's certainly not legally defensible. So the self-assessment versus attestation. Many level 1 and some level 2 contractors can perform self-assessments. But again, it doesn't mean checking a box. It is evaluating your entire security posture. All 110 controls of the 171 and the additional 17 from R2. But the real weight behind it is the attestation. That is coming from your executive team. It could be a CFO, it could be a CEO, any executive officer of the company can attest to that. What that attestation does is it confirms the accuracy of the evaluation. It's not just a self-assessment historically of, oh, we submitted it, we scored 90%, 95%, whatever it might be. It is now, we scored 95%. And now one of our officers has signed off on that. That attestation has changed the game for many small organizations entirely. Because as I referenced before, it's now enforceable. And what the False Claims Act does, the FCA, it takes that from being just a expectation to a requirement, which now carries civil, legal, and criminal penalties if it is ever determined that something was attested to and that wasn't accurate. So it's not really just a compliance issue anymore. Now it's an organizational governance responsibility. The most dangerous sentence in CMMC: we completed the self-assessment. And again, historically, that's where many organizations would do a self-assessment, log it, that gets them into SAM, it gets them into that federal contracting realm. Contractors like Lockheed would look at the spurs and say, oh, they completed the self-assessment, their score is high enough, we're good to go. Well, that's not going to work anymore. It is just a checkbox to do that self-assessment historically. Now, in addition to the self-assessment, you have to be able to produce evidence of your answers. They have to be producible to anyone within the supply chain that is asking it, not just a prime or not just the federal government. Excuse me. And that evidence has to include implemented controls, documentation, and traceable logs of actions taken to rectify any gaps that are identified. Where CUI actually hides. So CUI, the class or the controlled unclassified information. Many organizations that I've worked with and that I've talked to completely underestimate their compliance boundary, which is what is our footprint? What is our risk exposure? Where does that CUI live within our environment? And it is astounding to me to come into an organization that claims to be CMMC compliant, even though they're obviously not because they haven't received the certificate, but they filed their self-assessment. But then in working with them, I'm finding federal contract information in unencrypted SharePoint folders. I'm finding emails where they have sent signatory pages of contracts via unencrypted email. Unlocked filing cabinets. Program documentation. If you're working in a federal building and you have, as part of your contract, you were provided access keys, schedules, layout of the building, all of that is CUI. That CUI is directly part of just holding a federal contract. The example I use is one company I know of has a contract to clean the federal building in downtown Pittsburgh. Had no idea that they are going to be bound by CMMC. They're a custodian. They're a janitorial service. They're a building cleaning company. Why would CMMC apply to them? Because they're part of that greater ecosystem of the defense contracting industry. One of the big ones that I found as well is the vendor collaboration platform, which is any cloud-based system where you are working with a company on a project for the federal government. Not only are you now responsible for what you upload to that, you are also responsible for anything that you have access to. It's not just, oh, we don't store information in our systems. No, it's the access to it. And that's the audibility gotcha. And not only is it what was done with the information and why, it's who had access to it in the first place, not just storage. You can see something, you can take a picture, you can get it out of that environment very easily. Therefore, CMMC applies to that as well. So the first part of the CMMC process is getting yourself prepared, going through the configuration of your systems, implementing the process controls. You can work with any advisor. Bridges CIO does do that advisement. What we do not do is we cannot do formal assessments. Only certified CMMC assessors can perform that assessment. That's an auditor. They are going to come in, they're going to assess your system, they are going to audit your self-assessment terms, they're going to audit your documentation, your process controls. They are going to speak with the executive team, IT, to corroborate and collaborate with that formal documentation. Because it's the process, it's the decision-making process, it's everything that goes into how you store and go about your security stance. So what would an assessor usually start with? Where does CUI enter the organization? Is it through emails? Is it through sent documents? Is it provision of access to a secure system where you can download drawings if you need? Is it a phone call in which the details of a organization, I'm sorry, just popped up a question here. Are these assessments limited to CP3AO? No, there's actually a sublevel. The CCP is the initial assessor who comes in, quantifies everything, and then places the organization into the assessment process. The C3PAO is the organization that will actually make final determination on your qualifications and then put you into the certificate receival process. So there's an entire ecosystem, a little bit of a tangent here. There's an entire ecosystem that has popped up around CMMC. You have your assessors, you have your CCP, you have your advisors first and foremost to help you prepare for the assessor. Then the CCP comes in, assesses it, makes everything aligned with what the C3PAO is going to anticipate in the format that they need it in. Then once that's done, they submit it to the C3PAO for assessment. There's currently about, I think, a 6 to 9 month backlog on this. But when they get to you, they go through all of the documentation. Now, if everything is gone well and you are passing everything on your first attempt, which is rare, that C3PAO is going to be the one that makes the final determination that yes, they are CMMC 2.0 compliant. they can now be put into the process to actually receive their certificate. So that ecosystem is the advisement, the initial assessment, and then the certification board itself. And that's the C3PAO that was just brought up. So which systems store or process the CUI? And that's where, is it stored in SharePoint? Is it stored on a local machine? Is it stored on your mobile device? Is it stored in email? Do you have physical copies? And one of the things that I've found with organizations right now is there's been a real explosion in AI assisted note taking, both through Zoom, Teams, Read AI, Otter AI is another one, Fellows Note Taker. One of the more interesting aspects of this is the applications that record conversations where details of contract are discussed. Send that outside the organization to a third party. Zoom.ai is notorious for this. Zoom's AI assistant will record a conversation, take notes on it, assess those notes, recompile them, and then present them back to you. It's extraordinarily useful. It's extraordinarily helpful, but it is also completely non-compliant because now that's another CUI ingress and egress. So not only are you discussing this information now, a third-party system has access to that information. And all it was a voice conversation that got translated into actual documentation and then egressed the organization. An assessor and auditor is going to pick up on that. Third, this is the classic. Who has access to the systems that store information? Straightforward. Most IT departments can help that or help with that. But when it comes down to the governance, IT is going to be the first one to tell you there's a lot of people outside of the standard process that have access to that information. How are the assessment results validated? That's an internal assessment. How do you validate your processes and your implementation? And that's where the CCP comes in. That's a third-party assessment that you have to have done. That is a third-party assessment through a certified, recognized organization that's part of the CMMC ecosystem. So where do organizations misunderstand their risk? This has come up time and again. Policies alone don't demonstrate compliance. You could have all of the policies that you could ever want. You could be a 20-person shop that has 40 different policies, ranging from how you come into the building, how the toilets are cleaned, how you handle CUI, how you record phone calls, the path you take to your place of employment every day. Policies don't do anything. They're just hey, we have a policy. This is what should be done. But it's the enforcement of that. It's the governance around those to make sure that people are actually following the policies. This is new to most organizations I've spoken with. Your vendor security does not equal contractor compliance. You cannot rely on your MSP, your service provider, your platform provider, be it something like SAP. You cannot rely on them to be compliant. You alone are responsible for ensuring compliance of not only what you do, but everything that you use. And again, this goes back to the entire point of this presentation is self-assessment does not mean reduced oversight. It now means you're wholly responsible for being accountable to what you just said was. It's the LinkedIn theory. Everybody can say, hey, I'm, vice president of a multinational organization, and you have done a handful of deals in Canada and maybe the Bahamas. Technically, it's not wrong. But when you have to provide evidence and proof of that, that's where it gets tricky. The legal and contractual exposure. This is where the FCA comes in. Your contract performance risk. If you are not compliant, you can be barred from working with the federal government entirely. Usually that's not the first step that's taken. The first step that's taken is an regulatory investigation. Hey, we found reason to believe that this organization may not be fully compliant. So your prime might say, hold up, we can't move forward with your contract yet. We need to make sure that you're compliant until pending the results of the investigation. Now, depending on what the investigation finds, if they find out that it was blatantly known that the self-assessment was inaccurate, well, the attestation is part of the False Claims Act. And if it's known that that was wrong and somebody signed off on it, there's a whole host of criminal aspects that can be enforced as part of CMMC. And again, this is even at level 1, the lowest level that is 80 to 90% of the defense industry. It applies to everyone. The executive accountability. CMMC compliance in general just usually rolls downhill from the executive world. And if it involves personnel, it's HR. If it involves cybersecurity, it's IT. But it's not IT. IT is just a part of it. It is the executive accountability of knowing what is going on in your organization. Where does the FCI and CUI exist? Which systems interact with that idea? As an executive who is attested to this, you have to be prepared to evidence that on the fly. It could come from the government. It could come from your prime. It could come from anyone above you in the supply chain. You have to know if your vendors have gone through the process of being compliant. You have to be able to say that, yes, we've audited our vendors and they are compliant. And then you have to also be able to produce a documented, recognized assessment process as well. So the practical starting points for even level 1. Identify your entry points. How does FCI and CUI enter your organization? 2, map the systems out. Whoa, what just happened there? Map the systems out that are interacting with all of your data. Just having a complete picture of all of the software you use, all the processes that touch that, even internal processes between departments. Then reviewing the controls that you have in place to control that, which is policies, governance, cybersecurity posture, and then building the evidence, taking that complete picture and putting together documented, provable, ready to go evidence that says, yes, this is how things are done, and here's the proof of that, and here are the steps that we've taken, and here's who validated that from a third party. How did leadership teams reduce risk? It's the governance visibility. Excuse me. Any organization that manages CMMC well is going to focus on governance visibility. And that's, how are our policies enforced? What is the enforcement methodology? How transparent are you? It has to be open, it has to be addressable, and it has to be, again, ready to be provided at a moment's notice to anyone that asks within the DoD. Your federal contract is at risk if you can't. The evidence-based documentation. Just having policies won't hack it. You have to have the corroborating evidence behind it. You have to clearly define your CUI boundary. How does CUI and FCI get into our organization? How does it come in? How does it leave? You have to clearly be able to delineate that as part of even the self-assessment. And the vendor accountability, putting in documentation and process controls of annual reviews of all of the contractors that you use, all of the software vendors that you use, making sure that you have your business associate agreements in place with them. That's part of their attestation that's saying, yes, we have a specialized relationship with you that we can provide the information that you need to meet your requirements. Those have to be done yearly. So making sure that you're holding your vendors accountable, making sure that they're being held accountable for disclosure of security breaches, that they're putting together their compliance reports and providing them to you on a regular interval as well. Looking ahead, this is part of a 4-part series. This was just the launching. The next session, we're going to explore defining your compliance boundary. How do you build that definition of your CUI boundary? Based on that boundary, your scope is going to change. What does that look like? What is the risk associated with that? What are the governance steps and processes that you have to begin to make sure that your exposure footprint doesn't get out of hand? You need to mitigate your risk because, again, there are regulatory fines, there are civil fines, and then there are potentially criminal penalties all associated with this process. And as part of that expansion risk, how do organizations unintentionally widen their CMMC environment? Scope creep happens even in the smallest of projects. It's going to get worse and worse if you don't get a hold of it right now. So, if this raised any questions for you, if you have questions about your CUI, if you have questions about how to build the evidence, if you feel your governance might not be as transparent as it needs, you probably want to start with an internal review, an internal assessment of your situation before you even engage the CCP. With that, that brings us to the end of nearly to the end of our time. I have a tendency to go on about this. I find it fascinating, and I know it's probably not the most interesting of topics, but I am trying to bring awareness to it. I am trying to make it real for people in terms of going down this road does produce business value. And odds are you probably are going to be affected about it in some capacity. I see a hand raised. Um,
Yes.
yes,
Hi.
and
Yep. Quick question. So, from your discussing with CMMC and making sure that the vendors are also uh, compliant. So, is it
yes.
basically everyone in the environment needs to be compliant? So, I guess, would this be something where it would be a second offering that we might need to go to a vendor for? So I know. So
So
sorry, we're
most, not a problem. Most vendors are not going to be directly part of the ecosystem because they're just service and platform providers. However, how they handle the information that lives on their systems, they do need to be able to explain to you in evidence through their SOC 2 that they are fully compliant. Every software platform vendor that can be involved in CMMC has to be SOC 2 compliant. If they're not, you have a problem.
yep,
And as part of CMMC, there's an additional offering that you can ask them for. It's the BAA, which is the Business Associate Agreement. It's a formalized agreement between you and your vendor that states, we understand what compliance regulations apply to you. We can provide the documentation that you need to support your stance and your assessment and your attestation. They're not responsible for being compliant, but for you to be compliant, they have to be able to provide you the information that makes you compliant.
okay. One other quick question: do you
Yes.
have a link to the document
Uh,
that just describes all of the requirements?
they are freely available through NIST and through the Department of Defense CMMC website. They will go through all of the details, all of the steps, all of the aspects. It can be overwhelming. So if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. We are almost out of time. James, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, when you talk about the there's two quick questions I have. One is the
Yes.
S-bomb. I guess that's becoming the terminology out there now, where you map every vendor you touch and everything you touch,
Software
right?
bill of materials. Yes.
Yes.
Ah,
And then also, now, if I am a vendor for someone that needs to be CMMC 2.0 compliant, do I need to be compliant too? Do I need to have my janitor compliant?
So if you are in the process, if you are in the system, if you are part of that supply chain, yes, you do.
All
If
right.
you
So
hold
I'm in
any type,
someone else's SBOM that has a primary contract. I still have to, every vendor I have, I then have to validate.
correct. The example I've used is, let's say that Lockheed Martin has a contract and they have a subcontractor that can produces these specific components for them. Well, that's a prime sub. Both are part of the supply chain. Both are going to be CMMC required. Now, if that subcontractor has a subcontractor that produces the individual modules that go into that component, that sub's sub is part of the supply chain. And this is where people really don't realize how big the supply chain is. If that sub of a sub has an outsourced custodian that comes in and cleans their facility, that custodian has to be level one CMMC certified.
It eventually could spread to everyone. It's almost like 6 degrees of separation.
It is. As a real quick note, conservatively, there are 80 to 90,000 companies in the supply chain for defense contracting. That's the most conservative. The most realistic is it's somewhere in the nature of 120 to 130,000 different companies in the supply chain, which is just astronomical, but it is proof positive of how pervasive this is. And unfortunately, how the FCA and CMMC are constructed, it is incented. The whistleblowing is incentivized. So there is very real reason to ensure that you have taken all proper precautions and are fully aware of the expectation of requirement. You can't offload it anymore. You can't say, we didn't know. It's wholly on you and not just in, oh, we now lost the contract. That's you lost the contract. Now you're getting fined by regulations. There could be civil impact as well. And thanks to the FCA, if you were working in it and you knew you weren't compliant, now there's potential criminal action as well. We are a little bit over time. I apologize for that. I encourage you all to check out the other sessions that will be coming up. I will also be running HIPAA compliance sessions coming up every other week here. There are major changes coming by way of May 2026 that will affect HIPAA in ways that, again, most organizations aren't even fully aware of. But thank you for attending.